No, because every time we did that, we lost the YouTube thing, and we had to close it all down and stuff.
What, the link and stuff?
Yeah, we spent an hour trying to work it out. So fucking whatever you do,
Don't touch it.
Dave, we'll give it 5, all right?
Yeah.
Oh, is it? You're doing a live link? Okay, I didn't know that.
Right. Loud. I don't know.
Well, that's a room of people, isn't it? It's a reasonable room of people.
It is, it? What's the room of stuff?
You've lost me there, I'm afraid. I do remember.
Or do you want me to say yourself?
I remember like my mum had a tea towel when she was just
Yeah,
Hi, we're going to start we'll start really. All right. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I'm so pleased to introduce this evening the book launch of this brilliant book, Babylon's Burning, by Dr. Rick Blackman. Why not?
I've got a dodgy knee if you want to have a look at it.
It is a brilliant book. If you haven't read it already, please do buy it. It's in the bookstall at the back. And it's basically a history of the British anti-racist movement through music from 1958 to 2020. So before I introduce Rick, I just want to quickly just go through what will happen through this event. So Rick will speak for about half an hour through a presentation. And then there'll be time for any questions or contributions or any funny stories or anything that you'd like to ask or talk about. And then Rick will come back and briefly sum up anything that was raised. And then after that, the place will open up to more music and slides and a bit of dancing. We get the tables aside. So we hope that you enjoy tonight. And without any further delay, Rick.
Thank you. Trust me, I'm a doctor. Okay, all right. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for coming tonight for this launch of this book that's taken about 3 or 4 years of research to get to where it is now and to get it published. I guess really what I should start off by saying is the reasons why it got written in the first place, and there's two reasons really. Firstly, there was an alarming rise in the use of racist language and racism generally inside British society that seemed to have exacerbated since the 2016 European election, the Brexit vote. That seems to be happening, seems to be gathering at a pace. And really, I think that the way I was judging it when I was thinking about writing this was that however laughable it used to be when you'd meet people at work or in the pub or whatever, and they say, I'm not being racist, but, and then they go on and say something that was really, really racist, right? But to me, there was like a filter there, that they knew that what they were about to say, they shouldn't say. So they were prefixing it with, I'm not a racist, but. And really what happened, what I noticed that happened after 2016 was that filter went and they would just say the things that they wanted to say. So there was a shift that was happening. So that was one of the things. And we'll come back to this guy during the course of this half an hour, but Enoch Powell pops up very often. And and I was thinking that when he made his Rivers of Blood speech in 1968, the day after Ted Heath fired him from the Shadow Cabinet, literally the morning after, and I can't help but thinking that if he was to make that same speech today, the likelihood is he'd probably be promoted to the cabinet rather than kicked out of the pub. Such as it changed, and all of these ridiculous ideas about man of the people, someone who's shooting from the hip, someone that tells it as it is, all of this sort of bullshit language that we've come to understand really about the Nigel Farages of the world and the Donald Trumps and all of these people that happily use racist language. Katie Hopkins, who compares immigrants with cockroaches and stuff like that. The world had changed a little bit in terms of the free usage of racist language. So that was the first thing. Second thing was a complete, I thought, deliberate attempt by academia and academics to decry all of the efforts of what had happened over the last 70, 80 years in terms of anti-racism and in terms of how we've used music, our side, and people like us have used racism, have used music to fight against racism, and how, you know, most of us, I would imagine, in this room have got stories to share about how music has profoundly affected us. And I certainly wouldn't be here standing here today if it wasn't for what happened to me with punk rock in the late 70s. So it's also about reclaiming that tradition from academics who just casually bypass the whole of the sort of like anti-racist movement all the way back from the 1930s and Cable Street onwards, that it's just simply not important for them. But the most important thing, and how fascism has been defeated in Britain anyway, has always been by other forces. Has always been by Margaret Thatcher, or by the media, or by some other force other than people like us who've actually organised and argued against racism all the time. So that was really the two reasons why the book got written. So for the purpose of this evening, what's going to be the easiest way to go through it really is just to go through an outline of the aspects of what the book is. So it does, or attempts to do, four things. One is just give a brief history of British fascism, where it comes from, what it is. Secondly, the social and political background that give right to the three fascist groups in the 1950s, the 1970s and the 2000s that I talk about in the book. The three musical organisations that oppose racism and fascism. And finally, the role of subcultures as well, which, again, it's difficult not to, certainly up until the last sort of 10 years ago, it's difficult not to look at anything in British working class life, and especially for young people, unless you do that through the prism of subculture. Because subculture was such an important and peculiar part of life, really. Because I mean, similar things happened around the world, and there were similar types of movements, but they didn't gel or didn't have the same impact as the subcultural movement that Britain had from the post-war years onwards. So that's how the sort of structures are going to go. And we'll go for, and these will weave their way in and out as they do throughout the book. And this evening, although obviously I've only got 30 minutes, so it's difficult to get all of this in. But all the way through, back through Teddy Boys and Teddy Girls, through mods and skinheads in the 60s, and then punks, reggae, and then to a lesser extent casuals toward the end. But all of these different subcultural groups that have profound impacts upon British life, and especially for the first two groups that we're going to talk about in the 1950s and Rock Against Racism in the 1970s. So all of these groups that really are led and formed primarily by working class young men and women who just aren't happy with the way they see the world, and take a step aside and form their own identity. And very often their own sort of political ideas, their own language, adopt a particular type of music and clothes that goes alongside the subcultures that is at once removed from the high street. So the first thing before we talk about any of those things, I guess, is to try and get some handle on a word and an adjective that's thrown around so often that sometimes it almost becomes a little bit meaningless. Like, you know, you can see people having rows with traffic wardens in the streets, and the traffic warden will be called a fascist because they're simply giving someone a ticket. An over-officious council worker on the end of the phone will be called a fascist because they're trying to do their job, etc., etc. Is a thing, and often a word gets bandied about very, very often, almost to the point where it sort of loses its meaning. So we have to be, first of all, clear about what it is. So, and again, for the purpose of the book, we look at it in a way that we say that fascism is a cancer. Now, we do know we have a cure for cancer, which I think will be the abolition of capitalism. That's the cause of fascism. If we get rid of capitalism, we have no cancer. But unfortunately, we're not in a position at the moment, or any time soon, it looks like, where we're likely to be able to administer that cure. So actually, what happens is this cancer of fascism goes into remission sometimes, and then sometimes it becomes malignant. So the times where it becomes malignant are the times the groups that we talk about, the anti-fascist groups, the musical ones, come into being, and I'll look at those in a minute. Again, I think it's important to mention is it's very often the way history is presented to us, it looks like all of these different groups just appear out of nowhere. Tommy Robinson and the EDL just appeared after a demonstration in Luton one day. That nothing had been there before. They had no history with any other groups, and they're just angry young men who are annoyed about the sort of lost or forgotten white working class, as it's often told. That's the way the story is presented. But it's simply not true that every single one of these organisations, Britain First, the BNP, the National Front, the EDL, the Democratic Football Lads Alliance, the White Defence League, the Union Movement with Mosley, going back to the British Union Fascists, all of these organisations are linked to each other. You go back from Tommy Robinson, he was in the BNP before he was in the EDL. Before he met Paul Griffins, who was Nick Griffins, sorry, he was in the BNP. He knew Martin Webster, that was in the NF. Webster knew Colin Jordan, who was in the White Defence League. Colin Jordan knew Arnold Leese, who was in the League of Empire Loyalists. Arnold Leese knew Oswald Mosley. The baton is passed on to the next generation of fascists all the time. They meet all the time, they link up all the time, and they pass their knowledge down to the next generation of people. So these groups don't appear by accident. They're planning all the time for how they can get interventions inside society. So again, just to qualify really what I was saying about fascism and the ideas of what it actually is rather than its misuse. And I think very quickly, just to go through these 5 pretty much essential ingredients of what it is, right? Because it's not just someone who's particularly unpleasant. Donald Trump, however grotesque he may be and however repugnant he may be, is not a fascist. He may be on the road to becoming a fascist, but I don't believe he's a fascist at the moment. Nigel Farage, again, very unpleasant, deeply unpleasant character. I don't believe he's necessarily a fascist. There are certain things that separate fascists than they do with like right-wing populist nationalists. So, and I would argue it's these things. It's opposition to a perceived decadence in society. That decadence can take many different forms, and this is part of the reasons, really, I think, why a lot of academics and the media struggle to correctly or identify fascism or misidentify it, because the decadence can come from different, can be interpreted by these organisations in different ways. So, for instance, with Nazi Germany and Hitler, it was very obviously Jewish people that were the decadence. They had to be got rid of for Germany to be great again. For Mussolini in Italy, Jews and anti-Semitism really didn't play a part. But it was a perceived decadence coming from Bolshevism, coming from Russia, and coming from the trade union movement. Anti-Semitism doesn't play much part with Franco in Spain in the 1930s. Again, that's not to say that he wasn't anti-Semitic or wasn't particularly racist, but it doesn't figure in their propaganda towards decadence. And then you see, especially in this country, with Mosley. For Mosley in the 30s, it was Jews. For Colin Jordan in the 1950s, it was black people. For the National Front in the 70s, it's Asian people. And then really the Jewish question, as it's called, seems to dissipate really as we get closer and closer towards the 21st century. And then Islam becomes the major problem. And indeed, if you look at, I think almost without exception, every fascist organisation in Europe now supports the state of Israel, partly for political expediency, but mainly because it's against Islam. So you can see that this decadence, this idea of a perceived decadence from the far right, changes and is different in different epochs inside the last 100 years, and also in each different country as well. So the other things is the rebirth of nation. There has to be a revolutionary change to society, ultra nationalism, and then the subsumation of the individual to a highly centralised state. The state is omnipotent, takes control over democracy in the newspapers, in education, etc., etc. And finally, the anti-communism. So these are the 5 sort of key parts, really, of what I would argue the fascism was about. So once we establish that in the book, then we get to understand how the organisations that responded to these groups over the years, why they called them fascists, and how they acted and reacted in different ways. So. after the Second World War, Labour government, landslide Labour government, and what we see immediately, almost immediately happening is in 1948 is the Commonwealth Act of 1948. What this does is it takes all the subjects of the British Empire who were once subjects, it makes them citizens, and it allows them to, should they want to come to Britain to work, bring their families with them, and enables them to be able to work in Britain. Labour government lasts till 1951, and at that point, Windrush obviously happens in 1948 as well. That's the first boat that comes over that brings over Jamaicans into Britain. But the levels of immigration are very, very small at this particular point in time, and it's only really in 1952 that they start to take the numbers start to rise really. So Winston Churchill wins the 1951 election, and imagine, if you can, a society where there's a conservative government who are deeply racist, who are viciously cutting back on anything they can for working class people, but have found that there's trouble with the economy, and there's a labour shortage. So despite this Conservative Party, if you can imagine this, not being able to, being against immigration, what they're having to do to look abroad to try and bring in supplies of labour to the country, even though they're against it. So they're sort of exactly the same parallels that we have today is what Churchill's government faced in 1952. But moreover, although they were opposed to immigration, in order for the British economy to rebuild after the devastation of the Second World War, and because the economy was buoyant, they had to what they found they had to do was they had to import huge amounts of labour. So our friend Enoch Powell, it's the second time we've mentioned him tonight. He is the Minister for Health, and Enoch Powell gets sent out to the West Indies, gets sent out to Asia, and his job is to go and recruit labour to bring it back to Britain to work in the NHS and work in the railways and on the buses, etc., etc. So what the Tories are doing at this particular time in Churchill's government is they're doing two things. They're wildly promoting immigration into Britain, but at the same time, inside secret cabinet meetings, they're doing the following. Churchill himself, apparently, in all the papers that I read, was obsessional about inverted commas coloured immigration into Britain. He had his own personal file that was entitled "Immigration of Coloured Workers to Britain," and he brought up the problem of coloured immigration again and again at cabinet meetings. Churchill argued when they campaigned for the 1955 election, which he did actually win. Churchill argued that the slogan for the 55 general election should be "Keep Britain White." Aside from this, there was another committee called the Working Party of Coloured People Seeking Employment in the United Kingdom, and basically this was a subcommittee that employed spies that ostensibly was engaged in going down to labour exchanges to spy on black people as they were trying to get jobs, and then inventing stories about them, like working and drawing the dole at the same time. So these bogus spying, and then there was a third committee called the Immigration and Repatriation Commonwealth and Coloured Colonials Home Office Working Party. And what these groups is that basically they sought evidence that coloured immigrants had undesirable biological characteristics that made them incompatible with English people. So whilst on the one hand, Enoch Powell is going out to all four corners of the globe to recruiting black and Asian labour to come here, this is what the Conservative Party are doing secretly to try and gather this information. Much of this information, this evidence, really forms part of what becomes the 1962 Immigration Act, which is one of the first steps in stopping black immigration into this country. So this is the environment that we're faced with, that the black people were faced with in the mid-50s in this country. And if you put that on the back of the legacy of the arguments about white supremacy because of colonialism and because of the slave trade and the British Empire, the England that these people are emigrating into is a very hostile and a very unfriendly place. So what happens is by the end of the 50s, this sort of discontent boils over into sustained rioting, first in Nottingham, and then secondly where we are now in Notting Hill Gate. The whole of the book starts, the middle, and ends around Notting Hill Gate. So it's quite apt really that we meet here. And indeed, actually, I should have mentioned this at the start. That Mosley used to meet in this very room in 1959 for his to coordinate his election campaign. Yeah. Conversely, the Clash used to drink in here as well, so it balances itself out. Right. So what we see, it's difficult to ascertain, of course, with all of these, with any riot really, where it actually comes from. There is simmering discontent that is happening over the course of the summer. But what sparked it in Nottingham, and definitely what sparked it in Notting Hill Gate, was a white woman going out with a black guy. So this is the thing that actually caused the riot to spill over. And I think, you know, you look back on these things now, and I think there's a sort of element of this in the Second World War with the American GIs coming over, you know, the whole oversexed, overpaid and over here argument that these guys have money, they look good in their uniforms. And if you look back at the pictures of the young black guys that have come over from the West Indies, you know, with the hats and the ties, I mean, they look fantastic, you know, so it's very understandable why this would be an attraction for young white women in this country. But of course, this builds up resentment for the white guys that are living here, and it spills over into racism. But to give it just sort of a little feel, really, of what was going on, and obviously excuse the language because this was written at the time. But before every act of violence that happened in the Notting Hill riots, there had been a union meeting prior to it. And when I say union meeting, I mean union movement meeting. So Mosley was here and was addressing people in the streets. He was doing open air meetings. So before every act of violence, there had been a fascist meeting that was stirring up the trouble. The Kensington Post, which is the local newspaper, was here, and it said the following: in the middle of a mob of screaming, jeering youths and adults, the speaker from the union movement was urging his excited audience to get rid of them, the coloured people. Groups of policemen stood at strategic points, carefully watching the meetings. Hundreds of leaflets thrown up into the air. A fierce cry went out into the air, and the mob rushed off in the direction of Latimer Road, just up there, shouting, "Kill the niggers." Right, so that's what the Kensington Post said. A police eyewitness that was there. The police had lots of off-duty policemen, undercover policemen now. The disturbances were overwhelmingly triggered by 300 to 400 strong Keep Britain white mobs. Many of them teddy boys armed with iron bars, butcher's knives, and weighted lead belts, who went nigger hunting amongst the West Indian residents of Notting Hill. 5 black men were left lying unconscious on the pavements afterwards. So every time this happens, Mosley has been there, and he's been doing open air meetings, and he's been arguing with, been urging people to go out into the streets and to be violent against any random black people that they see in the area. So this is the sort of atmosphere that is happening at the time. Terrifying. Tony Benn talks about in his diaries as well that, you know, it's a battle zone. People can't go. People have like barricaded themselves out. So, fortunately for the Conservative Party, because they deny that there's any racism involved in this, because to accept that there was any racism would mean that there's a racism in society, and this hasn't been addressed in any way, shape, or form by the government. So, very conveniently for them, because most of the violence comes from teddy boys, what they do is they put the blame firmly on pretty much everything that happens inside society on teddy boys. So just very briefly to look at Jesus, you're joking. Okay, I've just been told I've only got 10 minutes left. Okay.
50.
All right. Okay, so we'll have to skip through some stuff. Okay, so let's look at what the Conservative Party say about teddy boys, because part of this book obviously is about subcultures. So let's find out where we are. 3, it's thrown me completely off. Thank you very much.
You know, if it's all right, we can give you like another 20?
Right, okay. So, because it's much easier to blame the teddy boys than, as I said, to accept the violence that's in society. This is what the Conservative Party were arguing in 1958 at their conference in Scarborough. All of the crime wave that was happening in Britain at the time was, quote, the crime wave was the responsibility of these so-called teddy boys because they never had the stick. On conviction, they should be fined tremendously heavily, and if unable to pay, be made to work and work and work and work and work until they can pay off the fine. Sir William Robson Brown, Conservative MP for Esher, predicted that the teddy boy of today is likely to be the irresponsible shop steward of tomorrow. Furthermore, nationally, this is what these people advocated. The Conservative Party proposed there should be teddy boy jails designed to de-teddy the teddy boys as a way to solve the problems of British youth. To take the stuffing out of the teddies. Right, so this is the sort of language and these are the sort of political ideas that the Tory party is coming up with, rather than saying, okay, look, there's a massive problem here. The race riots, as they're often called, weren't race riots at all. They were mass attacks of 400, 500 people, sort of stuff you'll normally see in Alabama or Mississippi in the 1930s or the 1940s, unprecedented in British society. Rather than looking at and identifying the problem, the easy way out was to blame teddy boys for this. And I think had the problem been looked at in a different way, then the problems wouldn't necessarily have escalated in the way they did. So what happens? What's the first organisation that we look at that responds to this? The riots end on the 5th of September in 1958. On the 6th of September in 1958, on the front page of the Melody Maker, this one here, there is a letter that's written that's on the front page in response to the race riots. And it says the following. At a time when reason has given way to violence in all parts of Britain, we, the people of all races in the world of entertainment, appeal to the public to reject the racial discrimination in any shape or form. Violence will settle nothing. It will only cause suffering to innocent people and create fresh grievances. We appeal to our audiences everywhere to join us in opposing any and every aspect of racial prejudice, wherever it may appear. Now, I'll leave all this stuff afterwards if anyone wants to come and have a look afterwards. It's signed by a whole list of people. All the celebrities at the time: Lonnie Donegan, Tommy Steele, Tubby Hayes, the saxophonist, Humphrey Littleton, Peter Sellers, Cleo Lane, Matt Monroe, a whole bunch of other people as well. So this is the response, the first response, the first proper response. Doesn't come from the government, doesn't come from the local Labour Party, doesn't come from the trade union movement. It comes from musicians. These are the first people to actually move against it and to argue that something should be done. Now, there's a little clip here that we want to watch. We've been having terrible trouble with the technology, which hopefully will happen. So this is a panorama program. I'm just going to skip through to the end, right? So this is a panorama program that was broadcast in April 1959. So the first thing that the Stars Campaign for Interracial Friendship did, right, and that's some of them here, was they organised a Christmas party for black and white kids in Holland Park School, which I just found out is where Julie used to work. Not at the same time, I hasten to add. much later. But they organised a Christmas party, which was televised by the BBC. So black, Irish, a few Asian kids and some white kids that had a Christmas lunch together. Amazingly, the lunch was paid for by the American Embassy, who in 1959 weren't really getting it together when it came to integrated lunches in their own country. So it's very surprising that they actually funded this, right? So this Panorama program is ostensibly about the White Defence League. It's a fascist organisation whose headquarters was literally 500 yards down the road, and had White Defence League on the front of it. Again, there's pictures of this you can have a look at after I've finished speaking. So, but the second half of this Panorama program is dedicated to the Stars Campaign for Interracial Friendship. So it only lasts about a minute, but we'll just have a look at this clip.
I took the book with me to listen to one of their meetings. Several famous stars were there. Tommy Donegan, Cleo Lane, the German, is Johnny Dankworth?
Well, the objectives of the campaign are largely to counteract any cranky organisations which try to preach the gospel of a master race anywhere. So that such organisations as Mr. What's-her-name's seem laughable on the face of it, but they aren't really laughable because Adolf Hitler started a similar organisation about 25 years ago, which caused the deaths of millions and millions of people and the sufferings of millions more.
Now, it was put to me earlier by the spokesman of the White Defence League that coloured people ought to be repatriated from this country to their country of origin. Now, where were you born?
Southall, Middlesex, Southall. Yes.
Where would you be? If you had to be repatriated, where would that be to?
Southall, Middlesex.
Each span of life I've come across such a sea of bigotries and prejudices that, you know, I get so fed up with it now. I feel I have to do something about it.
Mr. Braithwaite, you're a visitor to this country, although you've been here for something like 15 years. Does it discourage you and upset you very much when you come across this kind of propaganda we think anything about?
Not for a moment. You see, it indicates to me the strength of British democracy that Mr. Jordan or his associates can say this sort of thing, and they are free to say it. You see, it also indicates to me that democracy means something to the British people. They can contain this sort of thing, just as a healthy body can contain a boil or a pimple. If it becomes painful, then they'll take steps to deal with it.
Right, so that last guy was E.R. Braithwaite, who wrote From Sir to Love, amongst other things. Lonnie Donegan, that clip is actually quite special as well from all the things that I read in the research that I did for this book. Apparently that was about the only time in his entire life that Lonnie Donegan talked about someone else other than himself. So for that much, you know, the levels of racism was so much that Lonnie Donegan even actually had some time to think about other people. So I've worked out a way I can do this. So I'll put my conclusion, if we've got time, after the questions and answers or the rest of it, which will give me another five minutes to talk about the other groups that I need to.
Let's take a breather for 10 seconds. If people want to quickly come and grab a chair before we continue, I think that might be. All right, thank you.
Right, okay, so they had the Christmas party at Holland Park School. The next thing they did was they formed a small club called the Harmony Club, just down the road from here, in Blenheim Crescent, literally, 1,000 yards up the road. Under constant threat of arson from fascists, the individual members of this organisation under constant death threats from fascists as well. And basically, obviously this is pre-DJs, it's pre-disco, so all the music is live. So you would have had the chance of seeing Johnny Dankworth or Humphrey Lyttelton or Tubby Hayes and Ronnie Scott playing in these little churches around the corner, doing gigs specifically to promote racial harmony and against fascism. All of the leading jazz players were in this organisation as well. But just a little quote from Humphrey Lyttelton, who most people will probably know now from when he did Any Questions on Radio 4, was it? Sorry, I haven't a clue. That's it. Yeah. I mean, he died a few years ago. But in the 1950s, his main role in life was as a jazz player. Right. So he ran this club in Soho, and he had this to say: the regular skiff parties held in the Cellar Club in Soho are becoming a standard event in the London jazz calendar. Skiff, the Stars campaign for interracial friendship, hold these informal parties as a medium through which people of all races can meet each other in a relaxed social atmosphere. And you have to remember, right, Britain is still in a colour bar situation. All the top ballrooms, Mecca, the main ballrooms, have got an explicit colour bar. Black people are not allowed into places to dance. Clubs in Soho even, it's an unwritten law. You are not allowed to go in. There is no mixing between white and black people. So although this might seem sort of small-scale stuff when we compare it to stuff, like Band-Aid and whatever, right, at the time, this is radical stuff, and people that are doing this are literally putting their lives in danger because, they're not only are they breaking the law, but they risk, attacks from teddy boys. So as the evening progressed, the rum and Coca-Cola flowed, the two groups became inextricably entangled. That's black people and the white people. And at the climax of the evening, we all set off around the room in a spontaneous procession, followed by a winding kaleidoscope of crocodile of dancers. The skiff parties are rapidly establishing the right atmosphere for a similar outbreak of spontaneous combustion. When it happens, Soho and its precincts may witness a racial disturbance of an altogether happy and festive nature. Being of a generous and expansive frame of mind, we might even wind our joyful way to Notting Hill and serenade Sir Oswald Mosley in his electoral headquarters. Now, as far as I'm aware, this is the only time that anti-fascists have ever argued for the use of the conga as a way of defeating fascism. So again, you know, this is all very tame stuff, right? You know, what we're used to and how we understand the world and how we organise stuff against racism, how music was later used, like, you know, the carnival for Rock Against Racism. But at the time, this was radical stuff. Okay, loads more I could say, but I've got to really, seriously, I've got to move on. So what happens then? Mosley stands in the 1959 election. It's a disgusting election, dripping with racism. All the time, his opening speech when he says, "I've come to Notting Hill Gate to call a spade," to tell you how it is. Right, this is how it all starts. A guy gets killed called Kelso Cochran. Mosley, he gets killed just up the road here. An Antiguan guy on his way home. Mosley holds meetings on the exact spot where Kelso Cochran was murdered by members of his own organisation. It'd be the same thing as a BNP holding meetings on the spot where Stephen Lawrence was murdered. I mean, stuff that just wouldn't happen now. You know, the terrain is so much, and people are grappling, anti-racist, and the local black community trying to grapple to find ways of how they fight, argue against this and fight back against this. So what happens? He loses the election. Mosley loses the election, campaign against immigration, etc., etc. He disappears, comes back again in 1966, loses his deposit again, and where does Mosley end up? He goes and be an immigrant himself and lives the rest of his life in France. Like all of them, the stench of hypocrisy is sickening. Right, so 59 election goes, 1960s happen. They come back to the subcultural. What's different about the subcultures that happened in the 1960s, that's radically different than what happened in the 1950s and Teddy Boys, is there's an embrace of black culture. So the first subculture is mods. They take their name from modern jazz, ostensibly African-American music. Their clothes from the covers of these albums, Ivy League clothing, ostensibly a black clothing, but also from European clothes as well, drive Italian scooters. The whole outlook of modernists is a looking forward and is a celebration of other countries, other cultures, but in particular, black culture. So this is a radical departure from the Teddy Boys. Most noticeably, and especially around this area as well, is the adoption of ska music from Jamaica that's happened at the time. It's still absolutely taken up by mods and dancing clubs. A lot of the clothes that the Jamaican guys are wearing is copied. And so this sort of like, although there's not really any noticeable black people involved in the mod subculture as such for quite a series of complicated reasons that I can't really go into, but mainly age. But partly that they didn't really need to do that because all these young people would come into black clubs around here, black clubs in Soho. So, you know, it wasn't that black people needed to move towards a subcultural thing, but the young white kids, mods, were moving towards there. So there's a wholesale adoption of the music and the clothes, and people become friends. So it's a complete rejection of everything that Teddy Boys have stood. And then the second subculture of note, really, in the late 60s is skinheads, which, you know, for all of us in this room will know what we mean when we talk about skinheads, and usually the association is with violence. But skinheads were the first multiracial and multicultural youth subculture in this country. There were black skinheads all over the certainly in London and in Birmingham as well. It is a black and white movement subculture to start with. There is no racism that's involved in it. I mean, it's not to say that individuals weren't racist, because of course they were. But in terms of, if we look at what Teddy Boys were, skinheads at the start, at least, were the adoption of rocksteady music, because it's always about the clothes and the music. They've adopted this stuff. So what we see from these two subcultures in the 60s is a movement by the 1970s that a lot of the arguments that we had to have in the late 50s against Teddy Boys and the racism of Teddy Boys, to some extent, didn't have to happen because there had been that black and white link that had been established. Two other important things that happened in the 60s. Third time we've mentioned him, Enoch Powell, 1968 Rivers of Blood speech. From Mosley's defeat in the 59 election all the way through to 1968, the far right are withering on the vines. Really, they're not really that important. The program that's just started called Ridley Road on Sunday nights. I won't tell you what I think of that, but suffice to say that I mean they've got it wrong that the focus of Colin Jordan by this point wasn't Jews. It was absolutely black people. So they've got it wrong. But how they're defeated is important because they're defeated by working class activists. They're not defeated by anything else, and it's really an anti-black racism that Jordan has. But that's beside the point. But from 1959 and Mosley's defeat to 1968, the far right, the fascist right in this country are really marginalised. They're not important in this country. What Enoch Powell's speech, Rivers of Blood speech, where he talks about a black man having the whip hand in 10 or 15 years, whatever it is, poisonous racism. What it does is it allows into common language, the language of the far right, and gives the National Front, who've been formed the year before in 1967, gives them a road into popular politics and an echo of what Powell has said. And it's from that moment on, really, that the National Front start to build massively and massively quickly as well. A terrifying rate, a rate of growth. And again, I'm speeding through this, so I would have liked to spend a little bit more time going through it. But really, by 1975, 1974, 1975, are polling third place in many local elections and for MPs as well. So they'd be on the verge of becoming the third respectable part of British politics. And on the back of that, lots of independent organisations are sort of like springing up all over the country who are concerned about it. Trade unionists, women's groups, black groups, local groups of socialists, realising that something needs to be done about this, but nothing has quite coalesced at this particular point in time. At this point, at a gig in 1976, the guitarist Eric Clapton comes on stage and pissed coked out of his head, who knows what. I know people that have been very drunk and very coked out of their heads, and none of them have ever said the words that came out of his mouth that night. But the response to this drunken racist tirade of Clapton really immediately puts into gear that something has to be done about this. And the first person that sort of responds to this in any way is a guy called Red Saunders. And so the letter from Skiff in 1959 is in the Melody Maker in that one. And then in 1976, after Clapton's outburst, Red Saunders writes a letter to the Melody Maker saying pretty much the same thing, that, that Eric Clapton's language is unacceptable, that something has to be done about it. And the letter says this, I'll just highlight it. When we read about Clapton's Birmingham concert, where he urged support for Enoch Powell again, we nearly puked. What's going on, Eric? You've got a touch of brain damage. So you're going to stand for MP and you think we're going to be colonised by black people. Come on, you've been taking too much of that Daily Express stuff. You know you can't handle it. Own up, half your music is black. You're rock music's biggest colonists. You're a good musician, but where would you be without the blues and the R&B? And the letter goes on, basically said, we need a movement to fight against the racist poison in society. We're going to use music to do that. Now, it's important to say that none of these people knew anything about the STARS campaign for interracial friendship in the 50s. It was, they followed an almost identical path of how they organised or began to organise against racism. This time it was directed against Eric Clapton. And again, the subcultural element, I think, is important. Red Saunders, the guy who wrote that letter, and in amongst a lot of other people, Red Saunders, who wrote the book that's next to mine on the back shelf there, Reminiscences of Ra, or edited it at any rate, had both been mods in the 1960s. They'd gone to black clubs and they'd listened to black music. So the music for them, they were radicalised as teenagers going to dances and listening to black music. That to them was an important thing. So Red Saunders said this about Clapton after the initial letter to the Melody Maker. I was a mod. I was really into black music, more R&B than the blues. Then there was that whole 60s progressive anti-racist angle. We thought Clapton was part of that. And that's why it was such a shock to hear him coming out with the foulest rubbish. That's why we exploded when we heard about it. So, because everyone thought Clapton left the Yardbirds because they were playing pop music. They weren't blues enough. Why would you expect someone who's taken that stance of defence of black music to come out with this nonsense? Anyway, so very quickly, what then happens is a campaign grows apace. Simultaneously, as the National Front are getting bigger and are getting more confident and marching more and more. So they use music. Fortuitously for Rock Against Racism, it happens at exactly the same time that punk explodes onto the streets of London, and reggae starts to really take a hold, to a large extent more so than the sort of jazz funk that a lot of young black kids have been listening to. Reggae becomes the oppositional language that young black people are listening to, and for many white working class kids, punk becomes that. So you've got two pugnacious subcultures that are simultaneously growing at the same time and fit perfectly into this sort of militant anti-racism that Rock Against Racism is trying to build. But the thing is that all of this now seems very obvious as we look back on it. But at the time, there was absolutely no reason why this was going to happen. Like, it's the invention of people who were political, thinking we need to connect the dots here. We need to ensure that Rock Against Racism and these like young black kids and these young white kids are getting together, because that's where the fight is going to come back from. Right? It wasn't a punk. There was a lot of punks were wearing swastikas and stuff at the time. You know, that anything to shock. Right here. So it took an intervention to try and understand what was happening and try and organise it together. Similarly, there'd been not really many black and white bands playing on the same stages together in the same venues up until this point. It was Rock Against Racism that really started that happening. So what we need to do if we're going to fight against racism, we need a white band, we need a black band. One supports, one headlines, and the next night we do it the other way around and we build it that way. Again, not an obvious path. This seems very clear that was the obvious thing to do now and the correct thing to do then. But then, you know, people didn't know. Again, in amongst death threats, arson threats, constant threats of violence, all of the early Rock Against Racism gigs, there would be a local trade union branch that would be there with baseball bats to protect the venue and protect the gig from fascists from attacking it. So the levels of violence were enormous and quite really unspeakable. It's a very do-it-yourself thing. It wasn't controlled from any particular centre. It was like people would write into Rock Against Racism and say, you know, hello, we're from Aberystwyth. You know, we'd like to be part of Rock Against Racism. And Red Saunders or Roger Huddle would write back to them and say, like, yeah, welcome to it. You're it. Get on with it. Right? There was no, you know, there was nothing really. There was a few sort of like, there was a magazine, a newspaper called Temporary Hoarding, where there would be sort of guidelines of how to put on gigs and stuff. But that was it. There was no money. There was no sense, you know, there was no computers. We couldn't just sort of log on and coordinate stuff there. All of this stuff was done by letter, done by the phone, and then by traveling to people. So there was an independence of all of these young people and some older people as well, who were helping out, of coordinating this stuff. But the thrust of all of it came from music. It was always about music. It was always about how we use music to combat the ideas of the far right. You know, we haven't always got time, and especially if you're a 15-year-old kid, you haven't got time to articulate the historic fucking basis of where racism comes from. You know, sometimes you can only do that in a 3-minute pop song, right? And sometimes the 3-minute pop song is better than some miserable old bastard bleating on about racism for 5 hours. Exactly like I'm doing. So I'm really sorry. So one couple more things to do. Right. So skip through the 80s. The specials really, I guess, are the culmination of Rock Against Racism. The last gig in 1981 of Rock Against Racism before the organisation folds, because the National Front get destroyed at the 1979 election. They lose everything. So the 1981 gig with the specials, I mean, is the culmination. It's not just a black band playing and a white band playing. It's a black and a white band playing together with a very powerful political message. Very, very quickly, sorry guys, very quickly. Last organisation, we skipped through the 1980s because basically they were shit anyway. Well, some soul music. Okay, it was all right. So skip for the 80s and the 90s, and then what we see is again a growth of the far right, especially in the East End of London. Again, unemployment, insecure working, housing conditions, etc. Blaming the wrong people. The BNP again linked to the National Front, and again after them linked to the EDL. the BNP start to do very well in elections. And in 2002, the BNP get councillors in Burnley, Oldham and Stoke, more than they've ever had. The BNP are the most successful electoral fascist organisation we've ever had in this country. Mosley never even won a seat anywhere. So with this massive rise with a BNP, a new organisation is formed. Love Music, Hate Racism. It's different this time because the music's different. It's not rock against racism. We're now in the digital age. People are listening to all manner of different stuff. So it can't simply be rock against racism. There's a carnival, the 30th anniversary carnival, excuse me, in 2008 that celebrates the 1978 Rock Against Racism carnival. And whereas in the first carnival there was one stage with a succession of bands, in the 2008 one there was 3 stages and a dance tent, sort of like a mini Glastonbury, if you like. And, you know, there was like electronic music, there was like grime happening, there's like rock music happening, there's all manner of different music. So Love Music, Hate Racism is a much more all-encapsulating title, really, to describe the diversity of young kids. Subcultures, as such as they are, aren't as important or as massive as they were in, but you know, back in the 1970s and the 1960s. So last thing, really, just to finish on is on the importance of it, rather than this just being a celebration, that there is a serious underlying organisational thing that happens, and a serious campaign. That all of these things, the Stars campaign, were absolutely part of defeating Mosley in 1959, just up the road from here. Rock Against Racism, joined with the Anti-Nazi League, was absolutely a part of defeating the National Front. And if I have time, I'll go through this in the conclusion after the questions. Absolutely part of defeating the National Front. And Love Music, Hate Racism, alongside with other organisations like Hate Not Hate, Stand Up to Racism, and Unite Against Fascism, that did much work. An example I'd like to use is in Barking. Barking, by 2008, had 12 fascist councillors. They had 1 London Assembly member, and the BNP had 2 members of the European Parliament. So again, this is the most successful fascist organisation that Britain has ever seen. Now, rather than just, you know, this isn't just about let's make a few songs and then hopefully these scumbags will go away. This is organising gigs. This is taking gigs to places where the fascists are strong. It's not shying away from the politics. Organise a night, but we'll also go and leaflet as well beforehand to say that we're organising a gig against racism. You know, we want people to come. We want to talk to you about this. Why we think you're wrong for voting for the BNP. There were thousands and thousands of hours that were put in by anti-racists of whom Love Music, Hate Racism organised gigs around in Barking at the time to undermine. And it's very interesting when you look at Margaret Hodges' response to all of this, which is initially that we should accept that the white residents of Barking have got a legitimate sense of entitlement over Africans. Right, that was Margaret Hodges' response. And afterwards, this is the Labour Party, and ironically, George Rogers, who was the MP for North Kensington after the Notting Hill riots, said virtually the same thing. And again, you know, it's not just the melody makers that where the comparison is. Geoffrey Ham, who was Mosley's right-hand man, sent a letter to George Rogers, the Labour MP, thanking him for agreeing with the union movement, the fascist policy. And after Margaret Hodge said that about Africans in Barking, Richard Barnbrook, the BNP London Assembly member, sent her a bunch of white lilies, thanking her for agreeing with the BNP policy. So there's a whole history of Labour Party politicians pandering to the racism because they're concerned about losing their seats rather than being principally against it. So after the campaign that was waged by these people, basically the BNP got absolutely wiped out, lost absolutely everything in Barking. They started with, as I say, 12 seats, London Assembly member. Eventually, 2 MEPs go. They lose all of their seats in Burnley and Stoke and in Oldham as well, and they're wiped out. Now, this is not to say that this was solely done by Love Music, Hate Racism. Certainly, this had a very large part to play in coordinating and gelling together a resistance of not just when you go to demonstrations, but afterwards, where you go somewhere afterwards to celebrate or to heal your wounds. So I've gone on for far too long than I should have done. So I'll leave out the bit I was going to do conclusion. There's loads more I could have said. Obviously, it's in the book. But if there's any questions that anyone wants to come back on, then hopefully I'll be able to integrate a little bit of what I was going to say for the conclusion into the questions afterwards. But thank you again all very much for coming.
I don't think Rick kind of went on for too long at all. I think we could have listened to much more. But we'll open this up now. I mean, do you want a 2-minute break, or are we all right just to continue? We'll carry on. Yeah.
It's very hot, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't think they're having any further because people have fallen out. To get away from me speaking, Moira. No,
Yeah.
she told me earlier we can't open anymore. So Mike, all of those clips I didn't get a chance to use.
All right, I think we'll